International support for Ukraine is holding strong as dozens of countries and organizations have pledged more than 1 billion euros in aid to keep Ukrainians powered, fed, and warm during the winter. That's as the Biden administration is poised to approve sending a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine to help shoot down incoming Russian missiles. Now, we've been following the Russian invasion since it began in February. We spoke to Ukrainian citizens here in New Mexico, and since we've been in contact with a journalist and filmmaker who's been on the front lines. Patrick Hillsman has covered military conflicts for years and has family here in New Mexico. Senior producer Lou DeVizio was lucky enough to sit down with him on a recent stop in Albuquerque to talk about the horrors and the triumphs he's witnessed during his time covering the war.
Joining me today in studio is Patrick Hillsman. He's an independent filmmaker and journalist who spent the last several months in Ukraine. Thanks for speaking with us today, Patrick. First, why Ukraine? I know you've worked in areas of conflict before as a frontline journalist. What about this situation pushed you to go and document what was happening there?
I felt something of an obligation because I had been covering a lot of wars that Russia specifically has been involved in, and I've written a lot of open source investigative pieces about Russian weaponry, and the fact that there was a large war that was involving some of the topics that I'd previously covered. And also one of my best friends is a Lebanese Ukrainian who I met about a decade ago back when I was covering Syria. And as the invasion kicked off, he was just chronicling the story of his village, which was being surrounded by Russian forces. Thankfully, they never made it in, but they were approximately 2 kilometers from his house. And the Russian and Ukrainian soldiers were actually firing at each other over his home. And he suggested that I come visit him and do some journalism. And I stayed in Lviv, which is to the west, and also traveled across the country to Zaporozhye, Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, which is in Donbass, Ternopil.
You know, how did Ukraine compare to being the other wartime scenarios that you've been in? That you mentioned Syria.
The major difference was that in Syria, one side had absolute overwhelming firepower, and the other side essentially had almost no firepower. The fact that the Ukrainians have stuff like early warning systems, advanced satellite technology that the Americans have provided them, has made a huge difference. Just having a warning of a few minutes is the difference between soldiers getting blown up in an airstrike and being able to take shelter and surviving. I witnessed things like that, where the technological edge that the Ukrainian forces have in some circumstances saves lives. And that's a massive difference. Whereas in Syria, the regime forces would simply encircle cities and just blow them to smithereens. They've flattened cities as well in Ukraine, but the difference is that it's come at a terrible cost for them to do that. Whereas in Syria, they were able to do it with relatively few casualties and thus no consequences.
Your piece, Comedy at War, that you shared with us, featuring Valaria, what made you want to follow a comedian, of all people, in a wartime scenario?
In a war, the kind of gallows humor that people have really says a lot about the conditions that they're in and what they need to get through the day. And what I felt was compelling about her was that she was an internally displaced person from the city of Kharkiv, which is a majority Russian-speaking city in eastern Ukraine, which has been viciously targeted by the Russian forces, which is in itself quite ironic because a large number of the victims of Putin's aggression have been the Russian speakers of Ukraine. And this runs counter to the propaganda that they've put out saying that they're liberating the Russian-speaking population. Of course, the president is Russian-speaking. The experience that she described to us is absolutely harrowing because part of what makes it so stressful for people to leave home is that as they left, they didn't even know where they would end up because the trains had to take the safest route to the west. So sometimes that would mean that they would end up in Ternopil or they'd end up in Lviv or elsewhere. And to have a country which in many ways looks like my country. You go into, they don't have Starbucks, but you can go into a coffee house, which is the equivalent of Starbucks. They have contactless payment. Everything appears as it would in America in a lot of ways. But then a few kilometers away, there's the second largest army in the world invading. And it was interesting to learn how people are really stubbornly insisting on clinging to daily life. And in Kharkiv, for example, there is constant shelling. There have been a horrible number of civilian casualties, yet the subway still runs. And having the subway operational, despite shelling, despite bombing, despite Russian forces literally trying to encircle the city at a certain point, is very, it's inspiring, and it shows a certain amount of stubbornness to insist on continuing daily life. And I think that she going on stage, making jokes about the war, which has robbed her of her home and of her career for the time being, was definitely something that we could all learn from.
Sure. You mentioned that stubbornness, and we've heard examples of that from other people that we've talked to from Ukraine who are here in New Mexico and just watching news stories. But how much do you think that that plays into the relative success that Ukraine has had holding off the Russians?
I think that people might put a little bit too much emphasis on there being some kind of unique character trait to people that live there.
Okay.
Because they're not terribly different from anyone else in how they view life. People want their kids to go to school, people want to be able to enjoy their life and laugh and be happy, and people are still getting married. But it's part of the reason that they've been so successful in fighting back is simply that they just don't want to die. They've seen what's happened in cities like Mariupol, and it's an apocalypse. So the idea of banding together to try to resist that is not, it doesn't necessarily take a unique outlook or a unique stubbornness to be willing to resist. It's just people's insistence on living is really what their secret weapon is, I think.
Now, you're back here in New Mexico where your parents live, and coming back, what do you want people to know here in the US, but here in New Mexico also, about what's happening in Ukraine?
I want people to know that the propaganda that's being put forward about it being some kind of country that's oppressive to Russian speakers is laughable. President is a Russian speaker. The cities that are suffering the most from Russian bombardment are majority Russian speaking. A lot of the times if you go out on the front lines, the soldiers will be speaking in Russian. And it's in some parts of the country, it's unusual to hear Ukrainian spoken. And that is the pillar of Putin's propaganda, is the notion that he's liberating the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine. And it's just false, because the Russian-speaking cities have been just viciously targeted. And I think that it's important for people to understand that that is not true. That is not a truthful message that's coming from Russia. Secondly, Ukraine needs aid, period. There's a huge lack of some basic supplies. Fuel is almost impossible to come by. It's rationed. And for people to be able to live normally, they need vehicles, because Ukraine is a gigantic country. So traveling between cities now that air travel is grounded is incredibly difficult. It can, you can be in a car for 24 hours sometimes, and you just have to get used to living in cars in order to travel anywhere. And things like solar energy, hybrid vehicles, cars with better gas mileage, basic medical equipment, things that people are not thinking of very much in the media or in public consciousness are needed out there. For example, there's a lot of volunteers that are going over there to fight, right? Ukraine has a large army, and it has a lot of manpower. What would probably be more helpful for them would be experienced drivers, or medics, or people that are good at operating drones, people that are good at repairing vehicles, people that are good at software. There's a need for everything now. And we just look at the military side, but Ukraine's success so far has as much to do with them insisting on keeping civil society active as it does on the military aspect. Actually, one of the first things I said when I got there was that I said, I think Ukraine might actually be successful in this war. And my friend said, why? And I said, because I just paid for a soda at a gas station with a credit card, and it still works. A lot of the areas around Kyiv that were devastated by the Russian bombardment, you can go there now and they're repairing them. I was headed east once, and I remember there was a destroyed bridge, and we had to sort of drive down by the riverbed to a little, a smaller bridge that had been built to try and to compensate for the fact that the bridge was blown up. And then a couple weeks later, when we came back, there was a new bridge there. And I said, this was blown up last time we were here, right? And it was repaired. So you see people fixing things under bombardment. That's extraordinary. And if you want to talk about what is contributing to them being able to at least fight for their independence, I think it has a lot to do with that. It's not just soldiers, it's everybody.